If you look at a world map, way out there in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, you might almost miss them. Just these tiny scattered dots.
Barely visible.
Exactly. But these dots, they sit somewhere really unique, right where the equator crosses the international date line.
Literally where the day begins.
Quite literally, yeah. We're talking about the Republic of Kiribati.
And those tiny land dots, well, they command this vast stretch of ocean. I mean, 5 million square kilometers. It gives them one of the biggest exclusive economic zones anywhere.
That's incredible. It's a place easily overlooked, but as we started digging into the sources you sent over, wow, such a rich history and facing some really significant challenges now.
Absolutely. That's what this deep dive is all about, really. We've got this historical overview, other bits and pieces, and we're going to try and unpack what makes Kiribati so, well, unique. Look at its journey, the culture, and these huge issues today, especially climate change.
Right. So our mission, yours and mine, is to navigate all this together, pull out the key insights, the surprising bits, so you get a real sense of this fascinating and, frankly, vulnerable nation. We'll touch on its role in World War II, that Battle of Tarawa.
A major one.
And get a feel for the Kiribati culture that's managed to endure.
Sounds good. So let's dive in. Where does the story start for these islands?
Okay. Early history, where do we begin?
Well, the sources suggest the first sort of major settlement in the Gilbert Islands, the main part of Kiribati, kicks off around 2000 BC.
Okay.
And these early settlers probably came from places like Samoa, maybe later waves from the Marquesas, Society Islands, Polynesian migrations.
Right, Polynesians arriving. But the material was clear they weren't actually the first ones there.
That's a really crucial point, yeah. For maybe more than 1,000 years before that, there were already Micronesian people living there.
Wow.
They were cultivating breadfruit, had societies that were largely based on matrilineal lines descent through the mother.
So an established society already in place. That must have created an interesting dynamic when the Polynesians showed up.
Definitely. A unique mix, as you said. How did these newcomers handle it? Did they just, take over?
Yeah, what was the approach?
Well, what seems fascinating is the strategy they used. These Polynesian groups, maybe less centrally organized than the Micronesians already there, they didn't just turn back or push on.
Right.
Instead, especially on the more remote islands, they seem to have used marriage alliances, really strategically marrying into those powerful Micronesian matrilineal families.
Marriage is a way in, a path to influence. That's quite clever.
It really is. It shows this cultural adaptation, political maneuvering. They'd position their own people, the sources call them memory holders of their past, alongside the existing rulers.
So sharing power initially.
Kind of, gaining influence while, importantly, keeping their own traditions going. And sometimes, interestingly, they even adopted matrilineality themselves to sort of bridge that gap, though maybe started out in a secondary role sometimes.
So they adapted, but they also maintained their own identity. You end up with this blended society.
Yeah.
But the sources also mentioned that rivalry and fighting between clans didn't just disappear.
No, not at all. That seems to have been a pretty constant feature for a long time, right up until much later periods. Eventually, Bima Island was apparently the only one left with this dual-gender rule. A Tautri-married queen co-regent, the mother of the male heir. Shows how complex it got.
Wow. Okay, so beyond the social structures, the material talks a lot about this really deep connection the Kiribati people had with their environment, the land and the sea. Sounds fundamental.
Oh, completely central. Their whole belief system saw divinities connected to both land and sea. The sea wasn't just, a place to get fish.
Right.
It was the source of life itself, food, trade routes, communication. But it could also bring disaster.
Wow.
So there was this deep reverence, maybe even fear mixed in.
So fishing wasn't just a chore, it was something more.
Much more. It was seen as a sacred practice, often had specific rituals, ceremonies attached. Yeah, even things like food taboos based on the phase of the moon when you were born. Following those rules was thought to protect the sort of inherent power of the sea.
That's fascinating. What about on land? The sources mention ceremonial platforms, marae.
Yes, the marae. These were key gathering spots. Platforms made of coral or logs, used for worship, community meetings, big ceremonies. And often nearby you'd find mangrove trees.
Mangroves, they had a special role.
Yeah, they were considered the oldest trees, and the belief was they were home to the island's spirits. A chukaro for men, maru for women.
Spirits in the tree.
People would sort of dedicate specific trees to these spirits and pray to them if they were in trouble.
How did they pray?
Get this, the sources say they'd talk into the ear of the tree.
Wow. Talking into the tree's ear. That paints such a picture, a really intimate relationship with nature.
It really does. And the marae, these platforms, they had a priest. And how that priest got the job, well, that's one of the most striking things in the material.
Oh, yeah. Tell us.
Okay, so the priest was an old man, chosen on the assumption he was sane, apparently, and his family didn't need to agree.
Okay.
But here's the really wild part. A few days before a major ceremony, the current old priest would be given something called the marike.
The marike. What is that? Do we know?
The sources don't say exactly what it was, just what it did. The tradition was receiving the marike meant the old priest would die suddenly right on the day of the ceremony.
What? Seriously?
Yep. Which allowed the newly chosen priest to just step right into the role immediately.
That is intense. A seamless transition, I guess, but wow. It says a lot about how they viewed the continuity of that spiritual role, maybe even above the individual.
Exactly. It's quite something. And the priest's job included leading worship using yarod clam shells to count prayers, apparently, and blessing boats and voyages before fishing trips.
And there were other rituals, festivals, chants mentioned too, tied to gods.
Yeah, festivals like Iang, Komua, and specific mortuary chants performed in these special areas called kunangals. Some chants were linked to deities like Ka and Takua. One was apparently a plea related to the dead child of the god Take. There were even chants on the last day of big funeral rituals meant to, like, battle the spirits of the dead. So a really complex spiritual world.
Definitely. A vibrant culture, deeply tied to the environment, with some pretty unique beliefs about power, death, the afterlife.
Yeah.
And this existed in relative isolation until the Europeans arrived.
And that, of course, brought massive changes.
Right. Let's shift to that era. When did Europeans first start appearing?
The first sort of significant sightings and mapping efforts seemed to be Spanish back in 1568. They saw some islands, Mayana, Nanuti.
They land.
They tried, but apparently failed, especially at Taroa, where the islanders were hostile. Then another captain came through in 1595, supposedly looking for some mythical southern continent.
So spotted, maybe mapped from afar, but not really much interaction yet.
Pretty much. Even later contacts were brief. Quiros in 1606 just sailed past, charted the group. Captain Byron in 1766, same sort of thing, didn't look too closely at these low islands.
And then came the guy the islands eventually got named after.
Captain Thomas Gilbert, yeah. He landed in 1790. But it was a tragic visit for him. He and most of his crew died there. Disease, storms.
Oh, wow. And even after that, there was another long period before Europeans really took an interest.
Yeah, the source calls it a complacent absence for about 40 years. Seems like setting up any kind of real presence took effort and money, which wasn't really happening right after Gilbert's disaster.
But that changed in the early 1800s. Whalers, traders. This feels like the moment things really shifted.
Absolutely. That's when contact ramps up. Driven by whaling and the hunt for things like sandalwood, coconut oil, whale oil.
How did those first interactions go? Was it fair trade?
Well, initially there might have been some exchange of high-value stuff. One source mentions Marquise and greenstone tools turning up, being adapted locally, so maybe some reciprocal exchange at first.
But it didn't stay that way.
No. And this is where it gets grim. The sources are pretty blunt, saying these initial exchanges turned into brutal exploitation, driven by these new industries, sandalwood, sugarcane, whaling.
And the impact went way beyond just trade, right? Socially devastating.
Totally. Contact brought things like the dollar, guns, alcohol, which messed with the local economy and society, often fueled fighting. But even worse was disease. They started recruiting islanders onto whaling ships. The sources call them destruction boys or ship boys.
Destruction boys.
Yeah, stark term. As voyages brought back terrible diseases like cholera, it caused rapid depopulation on the islands.
Just devastating. That term alone tells you so much about the human cost.
It really does. And all these new pressures led to more internal conflict, and the sources mention strange new laws popping up, like losing a leg for stealing some mutton or a taro plant. Shows how traditional justice was breaking down.
Okay, so by the late 1800s, you've got disruption, disease, depopulation, conflict. This sounds like the backdrop for the British deciding to step in and make it a protectorate. Why then?
Several things coming together. The Pacific Islands were becoming more economically important, sitting on trade routes, and the world market was shifting away from whale oil towards things like copra-dried coconut meat.
For plantations.
Exactly. Copra plantations were booming, and grimly, the depopulation actually made land available for these ventures. Plus, North Pacific whale stocks were running low.
Were the British also worried about other countries moving in?
Seems like it. The sources mention threat perceptions pushing them to declare protectorates. Doesn't spell out exactly who they were worried about, but geopolitical competition was definitely part of it. They started with the Phoenix Islands in 1892, then the Gilberts.
And the deal involved protecting missionaries and putting commissioners in charge.
Basically, yeah. Protect missionaries, appoint officials to keep order, and involve the trading companies. But because the islands were split into districts and commissioners covered multiple islands and they had this sort of semi-autonomous status, the average Gilbertese person probably had a pretty patchy idea of what British rule actually meant day to day.
That fragmented understanding, plus all the new influences, it must have stirred things up internally, too.
Oh, absolutely. Two main factions emerged, pro-European and anti-European. And the missionaries really boosted the pro-European side. There were specific events mentioned, like a chief converting, Kiribati women joining a particular religious group called connectionalism. These things led to what's described as a revolution on Tarawa, creating new divisions and political loyalties.
So we're heading into the 20th century. British protectorate, but with these deep internal splits, new religions, tension between tradition and the outside world, and then, bam, World War II hits.
Yeah, and that period just changed everything, left a massive scar.
The Japanese occupation sounds like it happened very quickly.
It did. Started December 1941, right after Pearl Harbor. They took Bama, then Tarawa, pretty fast. Shelled Government House in Tarawa. Wasn't much resistance, maybe some police fire.
And the islands became strategically important for Japan's defenses.
Exactly. They were vital ground, became part of Japan's defensive line across the Pacific. By mid-1943, they were building airfields supervised by, the sources oddly say, Army and Navy archaeologists. Maybe a translation thing, or just specific roles.
Airfields built, defenses dug in.
Yeah.
Setting the stage for one of the most infamous battles of the Pacific War.
Battle of Tarawa, yeah, a name that really resonates.
Tell us about Operation Galvanic. What was the plan?
Galvanic was the U.S. operation to capture Tara Atoll, focusing specifically on Betio Island. The Japanese had turned Betio into a fortress. Concrete bunkers, heavy defenses, big garrison.
And the U.S. strategy was heavy bombing first.
Oh, yeah. Massive naval bombardment, airstrikes for days before the Marines went ashore on November 20th, 1943. The idea was to just pulverize the defenses.
But the landing itself, notoriously difficult.
Incredibly so. The coral reef caused huge problems for the landing craft, and it was the first time, the sources say, that tanks were used in a Pacific landing like this, but many got stuck in the sand or knocked out fast.
Wow.
And the Japanese defenders, over 4,500 of them, were dug in incredibly well. They put up ferocious resistance, made it hell for the Marines trying to get off the beach.
It sounds like just a horrific few days.
Unbelievably brutal. The sources use terms like horrendous losses. 76 hours of intense fighting. The cost was just immense.
Both sides.
Both sides, yeah. Pretty much the entire Japanese garrison, over 4,500 men were killed, often fighting literally to the last man. And U.S. casualties were shocking, too. About 1,500 killed, over 1,500 wounded, in just over 3 days.
Just ghastly. A terrible scene on that beach. The sources also mention differences in how the dead were treated.
Yeah, it notes the Japanese dead were basically put in mass graves, while the Americans got more formal burials. A stark difference, even in death.
But despite that awful cost, Tara was often called a key victory, even a turning point. Why?
Well, strategically, it gave the U.S. a vital forward base. But maybe more importantly, it taught the U.S. military a harsh lesson. It showed this new way of fighting was needed. Intense prep, overwhelming naval and air support before landing, using tanks and infantry together. Tarawa was where they earned, at terrible cost, how to do amphibious assaults against heavily fortified islands. That approach got refined and used later, more effectively.
A brutal learning curve. So after the war, the islands are liberated, became a focal point of world interest, the sources say. What came next?
The focus shifted, yeah. The Gilbertese people had seen the war, seen the outside world, and they started talking about independence. They got their first real taste of representation with an advisory council. But the British were apparently quite cautious, especially about handing over judicial power, which understandably caused some resentment, like they weren't fully trusted.
And there was that weird period under U.S. administration, briefly, in the 70s.
Yeah, 1971 technically transferred to U.S. administration for a bit, but the islanders weren't keen. They were holding out for a promise of independence that involved New Zealand somehow.
Yeah.
That desire for self-rule was the main thing.
Right. That desire was clearly building. Which brings us to the actual path to independence.
Yeah, the momentum really built in the late 60s, early 70s, part of that wider wave of decolonization across the Pacific. Political consciousness was definitely growing. Debates in villages, political parties starting up.
But it wasn't all smooth politically. The sources mention a political disaster for the opposition.
Yeah, it seems the opposition party got tangled up in scandals and internal fights, and crucially, they didn't really effectively champion the growing call for separation and independence. This apparently created confusion, which the ruling party exploited really well, winning big in the 72 and 74 elections, so they were firmly in control during those key negotiation years.
Okay, so this rising political tide leads to formal talks with the UK.
Yes, independence talks began, although there was a bit of a delay because the U.S. still had claims on some of the islands left over from the war and post-war stuff.
Those got sorted out eventually.
They did. Talks got back on track. Agreement was reached that the Gilberts could choose when to become independent, and then they started drafting the Constitution for the new nation.
How did that Constitution take shape? What were the key features?
It drew on Western democratic models, parliament, elected president. But importantly, it also specifically included a statement about the Gilbertese way of life, trying to weave traditional values into the modern state.
Interesting.
They rejected ideas for a stronger presidency or a second house of parliament, kept it relatively straightforward.
And then independence itself.
July 12th, 1979, the Republic of Kiribati was officially born, taking its name from the local way of saying Gilberts.
So, a new nation. How were those first years? A smooth transition to democracy.
The sources suggest it was pretty rocky. They talk about 7 years of basically one-party rule. Yeah, apparently Radio Kiribati was used heavily to promote the government, and the opposition found it hard to even campaign on the islands.
That doesn't sound ideal for a new democracy.
Not really, and eventually tensions boiled over. In 1985, there was a violent coup attempt. Opposition supporters actually occupied the parliament building.
Wow.
Led to a siege by police and military. Tear gas, police storming the building. Tragically, people were killed in the standoff.
Goodness, a really traumatic event early on.
Yeah, highlights just how fragile things were. And the sources say this was followed by a period of political bullying and dodgy elections under later presidents like Tebaro Tito. Political parties apparently became pretty ineffective for a while.
So a really challenging road to establishing stable participatory government. Okay, let's look at Kiribati today. Government, economy, environment, the political structure now. Is it still that 1979 setup?
Pretty much, yeah. It's remained remarkably stable in its structure. Democratic republic, presidential system. The president is head of state and government, elected directly. Single house of parliament, the Maniaba ni Mongatabu. And local government exists, but the Constitution didn't give it huge devolved powers like in some Commonwealth countries.
And economically.
Yeah.
The picture sounds incredibly tough.
Oh, absolutely. It's consistently described as one of the world's least developed countries, very dependent on foreign aid, and money sent home by citizens working overseas, often as seafarers. The traditional economy is subsistence, farming, fishing, making copra, but natural resources are super limited. The phosphate on Banaba Island, that used to be the big export, pretty much all gone now.
The sources use that really striking phrase about development being blocked by a gelatinous form of smartness. What on earth does that mean?
It's a powerful phrase, isn't it? A bit obscure, maybe. But what it seems to be hinting at is this kind of administrative blockage. Not just lack of resources, but political inertia caused by this deteriorating national divide, maybe between the general Kiribati population and a sort of remnant colonial era elite.
Okay.
And this divide makes it incredibly hard to get necessary laws passed, reforms implemented. It just sort of stalls things.
That points to deep internal issues, really hampering progress. Are there any other economic options? Tourism? Resources?
Tourism is small, limited by infrastructure. There's talk of potential oil or guano, but the sources warn heavily about the environmental dangers, calling oil exploitation turning the country into an inactive time bomb, replacing natural beauty with rigs and rust.
Yikes. And there were some stranger economic ideas mentioned, too.
Yeah, unusual initiatives is the phrase used. Things like a fraudulent lottery scheme trying to sell land. It just shows the desperation for income. And there's mention of a big black market, maybe even eventually dwarfing the official economy. Suggests a lot is happening under the radar.
Okay, let's turn to the environment. The sources describe islands already marked by past exploitation and now facing immediate stress.
You can literally see it, apparently. Leftover stuff from past industries, abandoned villages, rusting machinery. And a huge constant problem is fresh water. It's scarce, and the situation varies a lot between the different island groups.
And then, looming over absolutely everything, changing the whole equation, climate change.
Kiribati is right on the absolute terrifying front line. It's not some future problem for them. It's now. It's daily life.
What are the specific impacts they're feeling most acutely?
Sea level rise is the big one, obviously. But crucially, that leads to salt water getting into their freshwater sources, the underground aquifers.
Contaminating drinking water.
Exactly. Then there's coastal erosion, land literally washing away, and changing ocean conditions, temperature, acidity. That hits the fisheries, which are vital for food and income.
And the sources connect these environmental changes directly to people's health.
Yeah, this is a really important link they make. Because of the environmental damage and economic hardship, there's more reliance on imported food.
Which isn't always healthy.
Often it's highly processed, poor quality stuff. And this shift in diet is directly linked to soaring rates of things like diabetes, heart disease, non-communicable diseases, or NCDs. A huge contrast to 1980 when most food was local. Now it's down to like 14% or something in 2013. Lifestyle changes, lack of nutritional knowledge makes it worse, global problems hitting local health hard.
And the government's ability to tackle this massive challenge sounds limited.
It really is. The scale is overwhelming. Sources say their capacity to plan and respond effectively is stretched thin. Sometimes they fall back on these sort of one-size-fits-all Western approaches that don't always work locally.
But there are local efforts too.
Yes, importantly, the sources do mention successful local initiatives. Things that value traditional knowledge, community action, suggest that grassroots approaches can make a difference.
But ultimately, the existential threat remains the rising sea level for a nation barely above it.
It's stark. For islands where the highest point is less than 5 meters, sea level rise is just unprecedented. The studies mentioned point to major inundation, serious impacts from 2050 onwards. Whole villages threatened, islands potentially becoming uninhabitable.
Are they taking measures now, like seawalls?
They are trying. Urgent measures like building seawalls, though they're expensive and don't always hold up, and planting coastal vegetation, especially on the west side of Tarawa, which gets hit hardest by erosion. But really, these feel like holding actions against something immense.
An incredibly precarious situation.
Yeah.
Okay, huge environmental, economic, governance pressures.
Yeah.
Let's look now at culture, how Kiribati interacts with the world and its future outlook. The language, Gilbertese, sounds central.
Absolutely. Gilbertese, or Tacubama, means something like language of the nugget, the core essence. It's phonetic, part of that big Austronesian language family.
Yep.
Different dialects exist. And cool details like place names, often coming straight from the environment describing reefs or plants.
But there's a worry about the language fading, losing ground to English.
Yes, a real concern highlighted in the sources. That if Gilbertese disappears, you don't just lose words, you lose culture, unique ways of thinking. It's described poetically as hindering the development of the speech, like an eye that does not see the otherwise beautiful pearl. A powerful way to put it. The loss of richness.
A struggle many cultures face. What about traditional arts?
Things like weaving pandanus, coconut fronds carving, intricate mat making, these are vital. Passed down generation to generation, no written manuals. They use natural dyes, patterns that tell stories, legends, family lines, a living history. This sometimes contrasts with more modern art forms pushed by formal education.
And their music and dance. Anything distinctive?
Very distinctive. Gilbertese dance is often seated or low to the ground, purposeful movements, always barefoot. There's a special focus on hand and finger movements, very intricate, telling stories. And traditionally, men and women often dance separately in different places or times.
Interesting. Now, despite its size and all these challenges, Kiribati is active internationally, right?
Definitely. Since independence, they've built up diplomatic ties. Moved beyond just writing letters to having embassies, regular visits. They have key partners. Traditional ones like Australia, New Zealand, who fund a lot of education infrastructure, and newer partners like China helping with telecoms. The U.S. has also pledged support, recognizing that strategic location.
And the sources mentioned that relationship with China and Taiwan has shifted back and forth.
Yes, they've switched diplomatic recognition between Beijing and Taipei a couple of times. Shows the complex pressures small Pacific nations face in that geopolitical contest. Kiribati is also very active in the UN, Pacific Islands Forum, fisheries groups. using those platforms to really advocate for small island states, manage that huge ocean territory. They signed loads of maritime treaties, too. They're making their voice heard.
So looking forward, how are they trying to plan for the future amidst all this, the SDGs?
Yeah, like most countries, they're committed to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And they've adapted them into their own national goals, the NSDGs, and had a national development plan running up to 2023. Education, SDG 4, is seen as absolutely vital for everything else development, sustainability, especially improving literacy, particularly for women.
What about the young people? What challenges do they face fitting into this picture?
It's tough. Education is changing, preparing them for jobs needing literacy, global awareness. But the sources mention this feeling of alienation sometimes from their own language, traditional ways of participating in society, even though they're expected to be future leaders. Plus, challenges getting jobs, maybe regional disadvantages and language skills. This tension has actually pushed some young people into language activism, trying to protect their local dialects and culture.
So summing up this deep dive, we've covered this incredible sweep of history, ancient migrations, unique spiritual connections.
Right through to the disruptions of European contact, that intense, scarring experience of World War II.
Then the complicated, sometimes violent road to independence.
Arriving at today, a nation grappling with severe economic limits, governance issues, and this truly terrifying immediate threat from climate change.
Kiribati really is this stark paradox, isn't it? Tiny islands, easily missed on the map.
Yet historically vital, culturally so rich and resilient, adapting for centuries.
And now facing some of the biggest global challenges. Climate change, economic inequality, cultural survival, right on their doorstep.
Their story isn't just about them, is it? It's like a magnifying glass on these huge issues that affect all of us, playing out in this incredibly urgent way.
Absolutely.
So maybe the thought to leave you with is this. Kiribati has this long history of adapting to new peoples, new rulers, new ways. Now they're fighting rising seas with everything they've got, modern tech and traditional knowledge side by side. What lessons can we learn from the resilience of the deep environmental connection of the Kiribati people as the whole world faces environmental change and struggles to keep unique cultures alive?